In the darkest hours of America's Civil War, the destiny of a nation hung by a thread, and at the heart of this struggle were the lives and futures of 4 million enslaved African Americans. The war, ostensibly about the preservation of the Union, was also a battle for the very souls of these men, women, and children who had been denied their basic humanity for generations. The story of how the Civil War transformed from a conflict over states' rights into a war for emancipation is one of the most profound and often overlooked chapters in American history. It is a tale of courage, resistance, and the indomitable spirit of a people who refused to be silenced. When the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter in April 1861, the enslaved population was caught in a maelstrom of uncertainty and fear. They had heard whispers of abolitionists in the North, but the extent of their influence and intentions remained a mystery. Meanwhile, the steady stream of propaganda from the South painted a grim picture. The Yankees were not only indifferent to their plight, but were plotting to sell them into even harsher conditions in the West Indies. The South was unconquerable, and the war would only bring more suffering to those who dared to dream of freedom. Yet, even as the South tightened its grip, a quiet revolution was stirring. In the cities, on the plantations, and in the minds of the educated few who could read and write, a sense of foreboding and possibility began to take root. The first gun of Sumter did not immediately spark a mass exodus, but it did awaken a tension that would soon erupt into a tide of resistance. Fugitive slaves and free African Americans began to make their way north, driven by rumors of war and the hope that this time the tide might turn in their favor. The North, however, was not yet ready to embrace the cause of emancipation. Despite the bravery of abolitionists and the growing abolitionist movement, the Union's leaders were wary of alienating the border states and the Northern public, many of whom were indifferent to the fate of the enslaved. Generals like William T. Sherman, Benjamin Butler, and George McClellan were initially instructed to respect the institution of slavery and to return any runaway slaves they encountered. The official stance was clear. This was a war to preserve the Union, not to free the slaves. But the reality on the ground was far more complex. As Union forces advanced into Confederate territory, they were met with a phenomenon that would soon become a defining feature of the war: the arrival of fugitive slaves. These contrabands, as they were initially called, came by the dozens, then by the hundreds, and eventually by the thousands. They were not just seeking refuge. They were offering their labor, their knowledge of the terrain, and their unwavering desire for freedom. The Union Army, initially reluctant to accept them, soon realized that these fugitives were a valuable asset in the fight against the Confederacy. The first significant test of this new dynamic came at Fortress Monroe in Virginia. General Benjamin Butler, faced with the arrival of 3 runaway slaves, made a fateful decision. He declared the slaves contraband of war and put them to work, thus setting a precedent that would be followed by other Union commanders. The floodgates had opened, and the trickle of fugitives became a flood. By July 1861, thousands of African Americans had found their way to the Freedom Fort, and the message spread like wildfire through the enslaved population. The Union Army was a sanctuary, and freedom was within reach. The Confederate propaganda machine worked overtime to counter this narrative. Southern newspapers and politicians spread tales of Yankee cruelty and abuse, warning that the North would only bring more suffering to the enslaved. But the reality on the ground told a different story. As Union forces captured key cities and military installations, the enslaved population saw an opportunity to strike a blow for their own freedom. They began to leave the plantations in droves, heading northward or joining the Union lines. The movement grew so large that it became a general strike against the slave system, a mass exodus that would ultimately change the course of the war. The Union leadership, initially caught off guard by this surge of fugitives, began to recognize the strategic value of the African American population. The labor and intelligence provided by the fugitives were invaluable, and the Union Army soon found itself relying on them for a wide range of tasks, from serving as scouts and spies to working on the construction of fortifications. The presence of these fugitives also put pressure on the Union government to reconsider its stance on emancipation. The moral and practical arguments for freeing the slaves became increasingly compelling, and the political landscape began to shift. The turning point came in 1862, when President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all slaves in rebel-held territories were to be set free. This act, while limited in its immediate impact, sent a powerful message. The Union was now fighting not just to preserve the nation, but to end the institution of slavery. The proclamation was a watershed moment, and it galvanized the African American population to throw their full support behind the Union cause. Thousands of African American men began to enlist in the Union Army, forming regiments that would prove their courage and valor on battlefields across the South. The Civil War was a brutal and complex conflict, but the story of the enslaved population's resistance and the Union's gradual embrace of emancipation is a testament to the power of human resilience and the moral force of a just cause. The general strike of the enslaved, the Contrabands who sought refuge in Union lines, and the African American soldiers who fought for their freedom were the unsung heroes of this great struggle. They transformed a war for the Union into a war for human dignity and equality. In the end, the Civil War was not just a battle between North and South, it was a battle for the soul of a nation. The enslaved population played a crucial role in this battle, and their courage and determination paved the way for the abolition of slavery and the long journey toward true equality. The story of the Civil War is in many ways their story, and it is a story that continues to resonate today. In the end, freedom was not given. It was fought for and won.